My name is Kari. I am a recovering addict. I was born at Wright Pat Air Force Base, 1990. My parents were together at the time. My dad, he was shipped overseas to Japan to serve 5 years. So I never really got to have that fatherly bond with my dad for 5 years. So growing up for those 5 years, it was me and my mom. We lived in South Carolina, and then they eventually decided to get a divorce, and I had to move back to Ohio with my mom. Growing up when I was younger, I remember my mom was a very big neat freak, and she always took care of me. And unfortunately, I suffered sexual abuse. It happens, unfortunately. And at that time, I was so young, I didn't really understand or grasp the concept of what had happened to me. And later on, my mom had got me into counseling to help with that. She had met my stepdad when I was about 2, and he was all that I knew until the age of 5, until my dad came back from Japan. Growing up, I thought I had a very simple life. I got actually the best of both worlds because my dad, he worked really, really hard. So I always had what I needed from my dad. And on my mom's side, I lived in a trailer behind my grandmother who pretty much raised me. My bed was put together by cement cinder blocks, if that gives you any bit of a story or backstory to my life. But over at my dad's, I always had everything, like anything, brand new clothes, brand new shoes, everything. Going through school, I used to get made fun of a lot because I lived in a trailer and, my mom didn't have that much money. And my stepdad, he worked odd and end jobs, worked for Firestone, he was a mechanic. And I didn't see nothing wrong with it. But growing up, as I got older, I saw a really big problem with it because, my sisters and my brothers never really had anything. And my mom had a learning disability, so she wasn't really capable of taking care of us to the best of her ability. So that responsibility was really put on my grandmother and myself. I remember there would be times I'd come home from school and I'd have to take care of the kids and I'd have to clean the house and I'd have to cook dinner, and because of that my grades really lacked in school. But yeah, over at my dad's I had a very, very good life, I can say that. I remember when I was going through therapy for what had happened to me, I got to a point where I knew what had happened and I understood it, but it happened again after I got out of therapy, unfortunately. And that was really the cause of my addiction. I started hanging out with friends, started skipping school, didn't really care about anything, started drinking a lot, and then came the pills. And I was 15 at the time. My home life wasn't the greatest. My stepdad was really mentally abusive to my mother, and I dealt with that on a daily basis, and it was absolutely horrible. And that was my escape. That was my escape from everything, from, being a sister and being a daughter and feeling like I was a mom. So I started drinking. I started taking all kinds of pills. It didn't matter what it was. I didn't care. I just wanted an escape from reality and from everything that I was going through. I remember there was one night that my stepdad and my mom had gotten to a really huge fight, and I stuck up for her like I always did because her mind was just like a 12-year-old. She couldn't comprehend stuff very well. And I remember I got kicked out for it. And I had to call my dad, and I'm like, I have nowhere to go. Can you take me to my aunt's house? And he's like, yeah, I can take you there. And from that point, I bounced around from house to house, couch to couch, wherever I could stay. I went to go live with my boyfriend's mom at the time. I didn't know what like real drugs were at that point in time, but she was doing like hardcore drugs and she got kicked out. And so I had a neighbor and they lived upstairs from me and they said, if you want, you can come stay with us. All you have to do is go to school. That's all we want from you. I'm like, okay, like no big deal. I just need a place to live. So at that time I moved in with them. Everything was fine. They worked, they partied, but that was on them. And I remember one night she was like, you don't have to go to school. If you want, you can drink with us. And I'm like, hell yeah, let's do it. So I drank Southern Comfort for the first time. It was absolutely horrible. And I proceeded to fall asleep in their bed. And when I woke up, I was like, hey, what the hell happened? And she's like, oh, well, while you were sleeping, we did this and that to you. Her and her boyfriend had. And that, triggered so much in me. And it was like reliving everything that I went through all over again. I moved back in with my mom and my stepdad at that time because I just had enough. And when I moved back in, I moved back into the things that I was trying to escape. And at that point in time, I had turned 18. I found him, and he introduced me to heroin. I had never touched it, didn't even know what it was. I grew up in Covington, Ohio. Stuff like that was unheard of for us. And I remember there was one night he was really, really sick, and I asked him, are you okay? What's wrong with you? And he's like, oh, I'm just coming off drugs. And I'm like, what do you mean? Because, I had drank, I had dabbled in pills, but I didn't have an addiction, per se, that bad. And he's like, oh, well, if you want, you can try it. And, curiosity, at that age, I was like, yeah, I'll try it. I'll see what it's about. And I fell in love. That's all it took. The first time, I fell in love with it. So after that, my life became getting high. How am I going to get high? And how am I going to stay high? That's all I cared about. And unfortunately, he was very abusive, and I didn't know that. I later found out. I was with him for probably about 3 years into my active addiction, and it was horrible, absolutely horrible. I had never gotten to that point where I cared more about drugs than I did anybody else. I was always there for my brothers, always there for my sisters, but at that point, I had got so far into my addiction, it was absolutely horrifying to even look at me. I was not the same. And I remember it came a point, we were living with his parents, and I just got sick of him putting his hands on me. So I told him, we're done. I can't do this anymore. And I moved back in with my mom and my stepdad. And at this time, my grandma, she had gotten really, really sick. And so I was taking care of her, trying to hide my addiction from her. And it was hard. It was very, very hard to do. And in the process of doing that, I met another him. And I thought, maybe he'll be different, blah, blah, blah. And it was just a love of drugs for us. That's all it was. And I remember specifically, there was one time I was going to panhandle, because that's how I made my money. I just begged people for money. And he got mad at me because I wouldn't give him $20 or $30. So we got into a big fight. We're on the interstate. We're going towards Springfield. And he proceeds to start punching me in my face and grabbing me by my throat. And it was horrible. Luckily, there was a guy behind us in a truck, and he had called the police. We were on a high-speed chase on the interstate, and he had luckily pulled over. But I remember after that fact, I found out from the police that he had just got out of prison for aggravated assault on his ex-girlfriend. And he had told me that he was going to take me out into a cornfield and nobody would ever see me again. I look back at that and I realize how addiction can grab you and take you to places that you never want to go. So I went through a whole court process with him. And after that was over, my grandmother had died. When my grandma died, because that was my mom, she raised me, I went even further into my addiction to where I didn't even know I could get any further into addiction. Instead of just doing heroin, I was doing anything and everything you had. I just wanted to be so high and numb all the pain that it went away. But the problem with that is, even when you wake up the next day, it's still there. It doesn't go anywhere. I remember there were instances where I would hang out with people that I know I shouldn't be hanging out with, and things would end very badly. I would get robbed. I've gotten beaten. It's crazy the things that happen to you in addiction. I know that I looked up to see how long I had been in and out of jail here recently, and I found out out of the 5 years I was an addict, 3.5 of them I was in jail. And the last time I went to jail, I had some felonies that I was looking at, and the judge said he was going to sentence me to prison. And I'm like, okay, I've been here for 6 months, I'm ready to go. I didn't know that prison was going to be what I needed. I was there altogether between county, prison, and a halfway house about 1.5 years. In that time, my mother had gotten in trouble, and she was in prison with me too. I went to a halfway house in Cincinnati, and I started going to meetings because I was like, I've got to do something. Like, I can't keep living like this. I can't keep doing this. And I had remembered one time that my dad did come to see me in jail, and he had told me that everybody was mentally prepared for my funeral. That was the most heartbreaking thing I have ever heard my dad tell me. And at that point, I knew I had to get sober. Like, even, just not even for myself, but for everybody else too. So I went to a halfway house. Everything was fine. I was doing really good there. And then it was time for me to go home. And when I went home, I went back to go live with my sisters and my stepdad. But one thing I didn't realize is when you go back to the places that you've been before, it's very, very hard to stay sober. So when I went home, you know, I had to deal with my dad and how he was a really negative person growing up, very negative, and I couldn't handle it anymore. And I remember I went out with a friend, and for a whole month straight, I got blackout drunk. And I looked at my sister one day, and I was just like, I can't do this anymore. So I packed a bag, and I left, and I went to Cincinnati. I didn't know where I was going to go, where I was going to stay, but if I get away from the people that I don't need to be around right now, maybe I have a better chance of staying sober. So I came here, I stayed with a friend. That didn't work out. I went to sober living, didn't want to abide by their rules, went to another sober living, and I had met a friend, a really good friend actually. And she's like, you know what, if you need a place to stay, you can come stay with me. She was really concerned about my sobriety and me staying sober, and that's honestly what I needed at that point in time. So I stayed with her, and everything, you know, went really, really well for me there. And I got a boyfriend at the time. And so him and I decided, you know, we're going to move in together and see how the things go. And in that time, I had gotten pregnant with my daughter. Biggest blessing I've ever had. And I went to go live with my aunt because I couldn't see myself raising kids in Cincinnati. Like, I just didn't want to. So I went to go live with my aunt. I gave birth to my daughter. Staying sober got a lot more easy for me because I had asked God a long time ago to remove it, the obsession with it. And when I had my daughter, everything changed. My whole life. Like, all I cared about was her, and taking care of her and making sure that she was okay, and she never had to see me the way my family had to see me. So, moved in with my aunt, trying to raise a kid, and unfortunately, sometimes things don't work out the way you want them to, and me and her father ended up splitting up. And at that point in time, I was still going to meetings, I was still talking to my sponsor, everything that I needed to do, and I met my other child's father. And I remember there was one time that when I first found out I was pregnant with my second daughter, I was so excited, but I was so nervous because I didn't know how I would adjust, from being able to go to meetings to not being able to go to meetings. Because having 2 kids is very hard, especially when you're trying to go to meetings and work your steps and keep up with your sponsor and have somewhat of a life, So I had my daughter. At that point in time, like I said, everything had changed for me. My life revolved around my kids, revolved solely around my kids. People don't really tell you how different it is being in addiction when you don't have children versus when you do have children. I don't know that aspect of having a kid and being in active addiction, and I wouldn't want to imagine being that way. But, unfortunately, some people do go through that. But if it weren't for me going to prison, I don't think I would have got sober, at all. Because I had nobody at that point in time. I had no family, I had no friends. It was just me and walls to look at. And honestly, that's what I needed, because if not, I would have been dead. I had my daughters. I have 3 kids now. My family life is so much better than I could have ever imagined. I pay my bills. I'm able to go out and do what I want to do. I'm able to take my kids out. And, my family dynamic is so different now than it was in active addiction. My family couldn't even have a conversation with me. Now we can all sit at a table and talk about, common things that we have in common, or parenting, or, addiction, because they understand. They may not have gone through it, but they watch me go through it. And I really realized, going throughout this process of getting clean and staying in recovery, that I will take my worst day being sober than my best day being high. Because you don't really realize how many people you affect, how many people you hurt. I'm really happy that I, get to be a sober parent, even though it's really, really hard sometimes and very challenging. And I get to mend those relationships, because I realized when I got sober and I started doing my step work, and you have to make amends to people that you're supposed to. Those people that I would tell them, I'm genuinely sorry, what can I do for you to make it better? You need to just stay sober. And I'm like, wow. That's all I had to do is stay sober, and you're willing to accept me back? It blows my mind. There have been quite a few times where I've done some outreach programs, feeding communities and helping out like that. And I wouldn't believe some of the stories that I hear from these women that feel like they're trapped and they have to live this life, because I lived it and it's absolutely horrible. And most of those women just want somebody to talk to, somebody to understand them, somebody who has been in their shoes and been in their situation and doesn't judge them. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I wouldn't have got sober. Unfortunately, my dynamic with my mom has changed a lot. She's still an addict, and I hope one day she decides to get sober. But I've realized that sometimes you have to cut people off that aren't doing the right thing, because it's about you and it's about your family and you staying sober. That has to be the most important thing. It's just, I have a beautiful life. I can't really complain anymore. I look at the things that I did in active addiction, And I can't imagine being that person anymore. Like all the pain and all the sorrow that I went through and the feeling bad for myself, I couldn't imagine living like that right now and having kids. That would be very, very difficult. And I'm very, very thankful that the judge sent me to prison because I really, really needed that. But what I've gotten out of being in recovery is that anybody is capable of doing it. You just have to have the willpower to want to stop. And you have to be willing to ask for help. That was my hardest thing that I learned in sobriety, is you have to ask for help. Because, you like to put on that persona like, okay, I got this. No. You have to be a team. Like, you have to have somebody. Luckily for me, I do talk to my old sponsor all the time. I don't go to meetings because I have 3 kids. I have a daughter who's autistic, so that makes it very difficult to handle her and go to meetings and everything like that. But I do talk to my sponsor a lot. Her and I are very good friends still, and we talk about our problems. And I need that. Like, I need somebody who understands my mind when I don't even understand my mind sometimes. Nobody's perfect. We all go through things. And I feel like the more you talk about your issues and your problems with somebody who understands it, the better off you'll be. Like, I've talked to my aunt, I've talked to my dad. Like, I love my family relationship. Like, those little moments that I used to take for granted are like some of the greatest moments to me. I'm just really happy that I get to repair all those relationships that I've damaged throughout my ripping and running and being on drugs. I'm very happy that people can trust me and trust my word. And they know if I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. My dad's been one of the main supporters that I've had. And he's always been a stable parent. Unfortunately, my mom, she wasn't able to be. And I'm glad I get to have a actual good relationship with him now and all of my family. It makes me very happy. Like, if I didn't have my family, I really don't know what I would do.